presentation on Hinduism and peace today. She will be giving another lecture entitled Gandhi's Environmental Legacy, Food Sovereignty, and Social Movements. And that will be held tomorrow, also at 4:30 in the Wall Auditorium. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Sanderson.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me here today. Just to add a little footnote to what Eleanor said, she pointed out that I am from the Northeast, but I actually have Southern roots. My family is from Savannah, Georgia, and I was born there and spent a bunch of time. So after spending a lot of my time up in different schools and this and that up in the Northeast, I've been sort of slowly working my way down. And I don't think I'll go much further south than Gainesville, Florida, because you go further south than that, you're actually heading back north again. So I think I've sort of hit my level in Gainesville. But it's nice to be coming a little bit back north up here today to talk to you all. And what I would like to do today is raise some questions about the concept of how within Hinduism people think about concepts of, someone's trying to get in back there, but he just ran away. How we think about concepts of peace and nonviolence within the Hindu tradition. And I like dialogue a little bit more than lecturing, so anytime anyone has a question or something doesn't make sense, please raise your hand, and there's no point in me just talking at you if something doesn't make sense. And I'd rather have some kind of engaged conversation than talk at you all anyway. So what I've done is I've prepared some remarks that go on for maybe 25 minutes or something like that, and then with lots of time for discussion. We'll see how that goes. And I'm sort of assuming that a lot of people in this room don't know a huge amount about the Hindu tradition, so I'm going to spend some time talking about some basic concepts within the Hindu tradition, and I think understanding those terms like Dharma and karma and things like that, I think that's going to give you a sense of how people begin to talk about ideas of of nonviolence and peace and justice within that particular tradition. So Hinduism. It's a hugely broad tradition. Within the Hindu tradition, it offers a lot of different possibilities for how we can rethink notions about how do we create a just society, what is peace, what is nonviolence. Also within Hinduism, I'll say there's certainly a number of challenges. I think Hinduism, and probably like Buddhism as well, has gotten a reputation of being pacifistic or maybe non-militaristic, which if you look at the history of Hinduism, traditional and recent, that's not necessarily true. If you look at the history of India over hundreds and thousands of years, you've got many records of conflicts between princely states, small warring kingdoms. So certainly within that continent, there's been a certain amount of conflict. You also more recently, and even starting with partition, for example, when India and Pakistan were divided, you had a massive amount of violence in, say, the last 20, 30 years. Even then, you still had some what they call communal violence, which is violence between Hindus and Muslims. And many people make the claim, which is probably true, that some of that's incited because of economic issues, fights, for example, over resources. But nonetheless, I wouldn't want to go too overboard and say how pacifistic Hinduism is. Nonetheless, the tradition does offer us a lot of resources for thinking about peace, probably one of the best known of which is the philosophies and thought of Mohandas K. Gandhi, who I'll come to towards the end. So just a little bit about the Hindu tradition. Basically, the Hindu tradition is extremely diverse tradition. When people talk about Hinduism, what you're thinking of is about 2,000 years worth of divergent philosophies and theologies and practices and rituals. There's no central founder. There's no one who started the tradition. Like there's no Muhammad, there's no Buddha, there's no Jesus, there's no one figure. You don't have a particular timely origin in which you can say someone, for example, had one action or some kind of revelation. There's not even one central text that everybody will say. There's not a Bible, for example, or a Quran. There's not one central thing. There's certainly texts and practices that most Hindus will find very important. There's certain texts that are central to the Hindu tradition. For example, the Vedas are texts that were believed to have been heard from on high. Basically, seers heard these texts about 2,500 years ago, and most Hindus will look towards these as authoritative, and in those you find some of the earliest theologies and hymns and ritual manuals. But those were heard from these sages, and orality is something that's very important within this tradition. Those were heard about 2,500 years ago, but since then the tradition has really flowered and blossomed in so many different ways. So for this reason, a number of often scholars will actually talk about the Hindu traditions in the plural, not simply a Hindu term Hinduism. And I would say part of the reason this can be a little bit confusing is the term Hinduism itself. And this is where, if this were a class, I was about to say, does anyone know where the term Hinduism came from? But I won't conduct it like that. The term Hinduism actually was something that was externally applied when some of the earliest travelers, particularly some of the Muslims who came into the subcontinent of India, they needed a name for the practices and the peoples who lived there. And so it was basically the peoples of the Indus Valley. So what you had was one name was supposed to cover this wide and divergent range of practices of all the people who lived in this enormous subcontinent. Nonetheless, even though that term was something that was externally applied, it's gained internal coherence. So people within the Hindu tradition over the last century, 200 years or so since British rule, they will refer to themselves as Hindu, and the term's pretty much been adopted. So it is a self-referential term now, even if it wasn't at one time. So what else? Before I start talking about some of the basic concepts in this, I'll say over the long history of the Hindu tradition, over time there have been a lot of debates in text and in stories, in the epics, about concepts of violence, for example. What constitutes violence? When is it allowable or possible? What actually constitutes harm, and when is actually permissible, and when does it have some kind of consequence to the person who actually perpetrates this? And a lot of the texts and the epics suggest quite a bit of ambivalence about the nature of harm and the nature of war. So what you'll see so much if you look throughout the Hindu tradition is not so much a lot of authoritative statements of you should do this or you should do that, but it's probably the best analogy, and I'll talk about this a little more, is to think about it in more of a narrative sense, in that a lot of the texts, even texts that might look like they're much more prescriptive, tend to be looking at these concepts of violence and war, and what should we do as human beings in a very narrative sense, in the way that if you're reading a novel, for example, or a story, these literature explores what humans should do, the consequences of our actions, and what might be the appropriate actions. What kind of actions should we do under given circumstances? So one of the most basic concepts I'm going to start with is the concept of Dharma, and this is a word that's probably come into, like karma, it's probably come into the vocabulary in the United States when people say, like, I see some people nodding their head, this is my Dharma, this is what I'm supposed to do. So it's a word that's become very popular, it's starting to become popular in the US, but it's a concept that's extremely foundational for Hindu thought, and it's a term that is a foundational thought for Hindu ethics and practice, and it basically provides the metaphorical and the theoretical structures for thinking about how should we as human beings act in relationship to the divine, to the cosmos, to other human beings, and even to all sorts of animal existences, or even other beings that might not, for example, sort of other kind of spiritual type beings. It's a blueprint for thinking through, what are our responsibilities as human beings in relationship to all these other existences out there, divine, human, ancestors, animals, everything that's out there. And just stepping back from that a little bit, one of the themes that I'll be talking about here is, within the Hindu tradition, is the importance of social cohesion. In that Dharma, how we act, what we do, a constant theme is how we as humans should be working in some kind of harmony with all these other existences. And towards the end, I'm going to raise that as a question and ask, if one of the principal goals is social cohesion and everybody getting along, what do we lose in that? Like, what gets swept under the rug if your chief goal is just everyone getting along? What sort of problems might get swept under the rug? And that's a question I'm going to bring up or sort of pose to you all when we have a discussion period. But this concept of Dharma, it's not something that has any kind of parallel or translation in English. Some people will make the parallel, translate the word Dharma as religion, but it's not an exact parallel at all. And many Hindus, in fact, will critique Western definitions of religion. I've had a lot of people say, oh, well, Hinduism, it's not really a religion, it's more of a way of life. It's a comprehensive kind of lifestyle, it's a comprehensive practice. And one of the things they're critiquing when they do that, they're thinking of the notion of Dharma, which is so comprehensive, it encompasses so many different aspects of life, and they're critiquing very popularized notions of religion that are really based on Protestant definitions of religion as belief. And so within Hinduism, so much of the tradition has to do with practice, figuring out ways to get along with this variety of all these different kind of beings. Obviously, belief theology is something that is there and it's important, but it's not quite as central as it is to some of the Protestant traditions. I'm going to give you a quote here about Dharma, which is from Austin Creel, who actually was a faculty member from University of Florida who retired well before I got there, but he's actually has written quite a bit on Hinduism and ethics. And his quotation is, Dharma is propriety, socially approved conduct in relation to one's fellow men or to other living beings, animals or superhuman powers. Law, social usage, morality, and most of what we ordinarily mean by religion all fall under this head. And so when we're translating Dharma, it translates loosely as a range of things, including law and duty and truth. It encompasses broadly the laws that govern, how we as human beings are supposed to act in a moral order, a cosmic order, and in a social order. That us as human beings, it's our duty to maintain. And so human beings and animals and deities, all of us exist within this larger moral order, and we as humans, we have rationality. It's our duty to maintain this. The word dharma actually comes from a Sanskrit verb, a verbal root meaning to sustain. And what this suggests is the idea of dharma, this idea of law and order and morality. Our job is as human beings, is to maintain this order. So we're supposed to maintain relations between the deities. We're supposed to maintain relations with things upon the earth. So for example, whatever kind of actions we take, whatever ritual actions and actions we take in a moral realm also have physical repercussions. So the idea is if, for example, if the crops fail, if something's wrong with the cows, this and that, these are, if physical things start to go wrong, it's a reflection on how well we have upheld our duty and how well we have upheld this cosmic order. And so if all goes well, the universe is supposed to operate in this very predictable and cyclical order. So that the crops are supposed to grow, the sun rises and sets. People have children, for example. If we don't uphold our obligations, then all this starts to fail. So if once the moral order disintegrates, when we don't do our job, we don't act morally, then the physical order starts falling away as well. And one reason why I'm spending so much time on this term dharma, because you probably weren't expecting a lecture on basically Hindu theology, is that it's dharma that really it's dharma which lays out specifically how it is that we human beings, what kind of individual responsibilities do we have. So it's a blueprint for the larger moral order, but it also is a blueprint pretty specifically for how each human being, how each one of us is supposed to work within that social and moral order and try to work towards maintaining a form of social cohesion. So the big question is, how do you determine what sort of behavior is dharmic, or what would be upholding of dharma, and what sort of behavior is not? And for Hindus, in determining what sort of behavior is moral, what is dharmic, they draw upon a whole range of sources. So custom, for example, what kind of practice goes on in traditional villages, that would be a source of moral order. They draw upon the Vedas, for example. I said we're authoritative. They're going to draw on local stories and narratives. I'll talk a little about the epic text. All of these are sources for how it is we're supposed to uphold this Dharma, how it is we're supposed to create a kind of a social cohesion. There's not one single authoritative text, but Hindus tend to draw from an entire range of from an entire range of sources, not one single text. And so this whole set of rules and conduct, there's a scholar at Duke, she refers to it as basically a dynamic and fluid text, meaning that these things are continually changing. It's not, this is, when they're talking about what's Dharma and how we're supposed to act, it's not one single eternal truth that we can always find. It's always changing according to the situation. It's a very fluid sort of an ethical contextual situation, not tending to talk in absolutes. So I'm going to talk about a couple different texts that start to show how we're supposed to think through these ideas. The main texts that present, there's two main sets of texts that present Dharma and how it is we're supposed to act. One of these are sets that are called the Dharma texts, which were produced around second century of the Common Era, the Dharma Shastras and the Dharma Sutras. And it's those texts plus the commentaries upon those that provide the most comprehensive view of what actions are considered dharmic. And what's important to remember about those is these are largely prescriptive. They're not actually describing what actually happened. They're describing the way society ought to be. So when you read through these, when people are talking about the Dharma Sutras and the Dharma text, they're morality tales about the way things ought to be, not necessarily reflective ever of the way things actually were. But what's interesting about them is they look at they discuss rules for almost all aspects of life. They're comprehensive for eating, for who you can eat with, what sort of relationships between different sorts of social groups, for example, the castes. How do you worship the deities? How do you offer food to them? These texts offer essentially behavioral norms for almost every single aspect of life. And again, we're talking about Dharma, which talks about social cohesion and upholding a moral order. What this says is that if we're going to have peaceful relations and a kind of a sustainable moral order, all of these, it's important for people to follow these exact rules down to the most minute things of what how do you prepare certain kinds of foods that you're going to offer to the deities. So it can get extremely specific. So on the one hand, I'm telling you that you've got these very specific rules about how do you act in order to maintain social relations. On the other hand, I'm saying it's a fluid text. It's very dynamic, and there's people always adjusting and sort of rethinking through these. So you've got those two tensions. Going on. The other thing that's important about these is that these rules of how we're supposed to act, how we're supposed to engage socially differ for different sets of people. So I'm sure most people in this room have heard of India's caste system. The caste system in India, it's a misnomer in some ways. In the earliest Hindu texts, you have a description of an ideal society which basically has four types of people, four basically economic or practice class. You've got priests, you've got a group of warriors and kings, you've got a layer of people who do all of the like farmers and artisans, shopkeepers, that kind of group, and then you've got servants. And one of the ways in which Hindus thought that society would keep going smoothly is that these people had their jobs. If everybody, it's division of labor, everybody does their jobs, things will go along smoothly, and that will uphold Dharma. If people do what it is they're supposed to, for example, the artisan does not try to become a priest, or the servant does not try to become a warrior, for example. If everyone does what they're supposed to, then everything will move pretty smoothly. That was a theoretical system. It probably never existed like that, but in the text, that was what was described as ideal. What you see or hear about today is the caste system is a much more complicated, extremely actually complicated set of social groupings that one of the primary benefits is who can you marry, what sort of group do you marry within, and what sort of group do you eat within. The word caste actually was the word that when the Portuguese came to India in the 1400s and they saw this extremely complicated system, they named it the caste system, and that word is sort of stuck. But what's even today, though, in terms of Dharma, the caste system, theoretically, it's losing some of its hold on the Indian population. I think at one point, theoretically, it was actually illegal, but it still dominates life in many ways. And so this idea of Dharma and people trying to figure out what sort of activities you do that are appropriate to your social grouping actually still is something that has some kind of a power. So I'll read something that Swami Vivekananda said about the situational level of Dharma, and deciding what it is you're supposed to do. Because each person, according to the Hindu tradition, each person, depending on your social grouping, gender, age, stage of life, for example, are you a student? Are you basically what's semi-retired? Doing your job depends on what stage of life you're in. So Swami Vivekananda was once asked, should one retaliate when attacked? He replied, if you're a householder, yes. If you're a renunciant, no. In other words, the answer depends on who you are. And so one reason why I'm talking so much about Dharma is when you start asking questions about violence, about force, about how do we retaliate, for example, if someone attacks us? When is it appropriate to use violence? How do we act if we're in a threatening situation? The answer depends on who you are. It depends on what stage of life you're in. If you are, and even more so, you'll see. Actually, I think I'll get onto that issue a little bit later. But what's important about that is how people respond to force, how people respond to violence, how you act really depends within the Dharma system on who you are, what your social grouping is or your occupation is, and what stage of life that you're in. So where do they talk the most about these sort of issues of Dharma? Some of you may or may not have heard of the Bhagavad Gita, which is a central text within the Hindu tradition. Starting in about the 400 to 500 BCE, the text, the Mahabharata, developed. Hinduism has two major epics, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. And these two epics are some of the most important thinking through or narrative treatments of issues of war, of retaliation, of what constitutes violence, and of when it's appropriate to use force. The Mahabharata is an extraordinarily long and rambling, essentially, morality play that plays around with notions of good and evil, what's good, what's evil. And Hinduism does not necessarily have a notion of theodicy. It doesn't necessarily question, the exact, the existence of evil. It tends to look at actions of good, right, wrong, much more in contextual situations. And like I was saying earlier, within Hinduism, you don't tend to have absolutes. This is absolutely wrong. This is absolutely correct action. They tend to look at questions of force, for example, violence, much more in a narrative context. Looking at a particular character. What decisions did that character make? Was it appropriate to use violence then? Was it wrong? What were the consequences to the person who actually perpetrated the violence? What happened to that person? And what happens to others? So that they're much less likely to have an absolute statement on right, wrong, good, evil, violence, and not violence. Much more likely to present all this in a contextual sense. So these epics have been much more, fairly long, rambling morality plays in which the characters and the gods and all the beings in them are wrestling with these ideas of appropriate action and violence in general. And so I'll set the stage for the Mahabharata, which again is this long, rambling epic. It's the larger stage set is a war between two princely families, the Pandavas and the Kauravas. And what's going to happen at the end of this long epic, there's going to be a cataclysmic war. It basically ends it's the last event of the era prior to this one. The era, according to Hindus, the era we're in now, the Kali Yuga, this is an era that we're in now, which is one of moral decay. And this big, massive war that basically wiped out, just a real scorched earth kind of war, that is the end of the previous era. And the stories that contextualize, that take place in this Mahabharata, again, are ones that help Hindus think through the specifics of what happens when you take certain actions and what are those consequences. And both the epics, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, these are not, it's not like the Iliad and the Odyssey, which we tend to ignore. We tend to, those are sort of in the background in life here. For these epics within India, these are front and center. When they put the Mahabharata on TV, probably about 10 or so years ago, everybody watched this thing. You could not, imagine Delhi, how loud and kind of crazy it is. There was no traffic on the street when this thing was going on. In fact, I was there and I got pulled into a house to watch it because, like, what idiot would actually be outside when the episode of the Mahabharata was going on? And so all of these epics, these stories, these are very much front and center to contemporary life and thought within India today. This is not some buried past like we tend to think of, say, Greek mythology. This is, people think through, what would some of these characters do? What would Sita do? What would Ram? These are heroes of the Ramayana. They think through today, how would a character act in a particular situation? So these are very much front and center to how people think through ethical situations today. So the Mahabharata epic itself is this long, rambling epic. In the center of it, and interspersed in this, is a dialogue called the Bhagavad Gita. And this is a dialogue between Krishna, who's a deity, and who's a charioteer for the warrior Arjuna, who's one of the brothers in this massive epic. And this poem, which is a much smaller interspersing into the Mahabharata, probably has one of the most interesting statements about violence, war, and the effects, and what it does to human beings that you see coming out of Hinduism. And basically what the question is, the stage opens for this text. The Bhagavad Gita is called the Song of the Lord. And this opens just on the eve of this massive war. And Arjuna, who's basically the hero in this, he's a warrior. This is his duty. He was trained. He and all of his brothers and cousins, they're basically fighting brothers against cousins. All of these people were trained. It is their dharma to be warriors. That is what they're supposed to do. But Arjuna he's in his chariot. Krishna's a charioteer, who is God, basically. And he poses this question. He's about to go into war, and he says, how can it possibly be right to enter into a war now that is going to have such massive destruction? I mean, he's looking at this thing, and everyone knows at this point there could be no good end. Nothing good can possibly come out of this war. And so he poses this question to his charioteer, Krishna, and the response to this is the Song of the Lord, the Bhagavad Gita. Literally, Bhagavad Gita is the Song of the Lord. The response to Arjuna's question is one of the most central texts within Hinduism, and it's probably one of the texts that people today, back then and even now, still are trying to puzzle over what it means in terms of Hindu thought and how do we act in the context of war. And there's been a lot of different interpretations, puzzling, people within the tradition, scholars, just in that. Gandhi thought a lot about this. Krishna's answer to this largely is that this is your dharma. You are supposed to do this. You are trained to do this. You should be doing this. You need to go and do this. But what he also says is, if you're going into war, if you're doing this, if you're going into this fight, you should do so without attachments, without desire, without the kind of emotions, the revenge, the anger, that without a kind of a personal attachment. Don't go in with hatred, for example. The idea is try to go in and do what you're supposed to do without the kind of anger, revenge, emotion that is going to, and I'll get onto the idea of karma, that it's going to help, build up your karma. What you should do is not be attached to the results of this. Don't be attached to the scorched earth, how bad can you hurt the enemy, but whatever you do, dedicate the results or offer up the results to the Lord. So don't be attached to the results of your actions. Dedicate any kind of results to the Lord. And so, this text has, as you would imagine, it's brought along a lot of different interpretations within the Hindu tradition and outside. Some of the readings of this, for example, are the idea that, and Gandhi himself, when he looked at this text, one of his readings of the answer here was that no matter what we do, there's going to be a certain amount of violence. I mean, war destruction to some degree is inevitable. It's going to happen. So one of the answers is then, given this, how do you act in that context? I mean, if war is going to be inevitable, how do we as human beings function in a way that is justified given the context that there'll always be some amount of war, and that's certainly been I guess a contested kind of interpretation, but it's certainly one. Some other people have looked at it and said, that massive cataclysmic war, that is basically the sacrifice to end all sacrifices. The warriors going in there, they're not glorifying war. It's not a means to enhance the dignity or I guess the glory of the warrior, but it's, in a sense, it's a monument to both the monument to the futility of war, and looking at those at the soldiers in there as basically containers for the sacrifice, not necessarily for as any kind of glorification of force. But the response that Gandhi has had to that has been certainly one of the more, I guess, contested but potentially popular ways of answering this, answering the question of how do we look at the Bhagavad Gita, how do we look at this notion of force in the context of war. And one of the things that Dharma does, some of the questions that emerge from this are, because Dharma places being a warrior, that is the appropriate job and the appropriate duties for warriors. One of the questions comes up is force really, is it really violence if it's done in the context of your duties as a warrior? Is that some kind of egregious violence if it's done in that way? And this is where, looking at the context of sacrifice and looking at, say, violence in this dharmic perspective, that's one of the ways in which I would say the Hindu tradition has actually, you could say, either integrated or normalized violence into the tradition. It's taken something that might in other ways be seen as somewhat egregious and said, no, these acts, because it's dharmic, because say Arjuna is a warrior, then it really doesn't count as force. It really doesn't count as violence. One of the answers there is saying that it's counts as force or counts as violence when it's something that is outside your dharma. So, for example, if someone kills a Brahmin, or if a person whose job it is not who is not a warrior, if they go off and kill someone randomly or perpetrate some act of violence, then it counts as force, or then it counts as violence. So, looking at a question of violence and force in the context of dharma, sort of, it creates some kind of it creates kind of tension there. Let's see. Okay. So just quickly, I'm going to wrap up the discussion of Dharma, but I want to mention just a quick word on the idea of karma before I move on to some of the contemporary ideas about violence within Hinduism. A word that probably most everyone in this room has heard of is the concept of karma. And the idea of karma is, it literally translates as the idea of action and the consequences. The idea that whatever kind of action you take, there will be some kind of consequence. And where the idea of karma fits in, particularly in ideas of, say, of violence and with dharma, the idea is if you any kind of action you do, there's going to be some kind of effect. And by doing these actions, especially if they're done with say, emotions or passion or attachment, you build up karma. And karma, the more karma you have, the more likely you are, or the longer time you're going to stay in this endless cycle of rebirth. And within the Hindu tradition, one goal is to sort of reduce one's karmic load, reduce attachments, so that you will escape this endless cycle of rebirth, this endless cycle of lives. And within the Bhagavad Gita, when I ask about what are the consequences of force, one of the questions is if you're acting without passion. This is one reason why Krishna says to Arjuna, do this duty, do your job, but do so without attachments to the fruits of your actions. Do so without attachment to your ego and without passion, because then by doing so, you're able to act without attachment to, without building up the kind of karma that will keep you in this cycle of rebirth. And the idea of karma is something that is fundamental to the Hindu tradition, the Jain tradition, and the Buddhist tradition as well. They all have different notions of how karma works, but certainly karma is an extremely important element of thinking through how it is we're supposed to act. So let's talk. I just want to mention Gandhi for a minute, because he's probably one of the most. He's commented on the Gita. He's probably one of the best-known thinkers about Hinduism and nonviolence and how we're supposed to be acting. Gandhi was a Hindu. Obviously, he came from his background was Vaishnav. He was from the state of Gujarat, which is on the west coast of India, and his sectarian affiliation was Vaishnav, which means followers of Krishna or Vishnu. But probably his greatest influence was also the Jain community, which is also extremely active in that part of India. And the Jains are probably some of the best known for their philosophies of ahimsa or nonviolence. And certainly concepts about nonviolence, about ahimsa, had been circulating within Hindu thought for at least several thousand years. Ideas of what does it mean to be nonviolent. Gandhi got a lot of his ideas from the Jain tradition, and when Gandhi and the Jains and others are talking about nonviolence within the Hindu tradition, it's not simply an absolute. It's not simply a theory, but it's really something that is active and something that is practiced. So on the examples of the Jains undertook a lot of practices in terms of how they eat, what kind of clothes they wear, what they do, to avoid causing harm. It's not just sort of stepping back and saying, I won't do something. It's taking active precautions to not cause any kind of harm. And so in the case of the Jains, that might mean, and this is more for, say, monks and nuns who are the strongest in their tradition. But this might mean filtering water, for example, or sweeping off a path ahead of you. They don't eat root vegetables, for example. You pull something up from the ground, you're killing the plant. So they take probably the most active precautions of not causing any kind of harm. And so when Gandhi was developing his concepts about and popularizing his concepts about nonviolence and how it was to act, he's drawing strongly on these Jain principles of nonviolence. And so when he talks about nonviolence and service, he's talking about an active kind of nonviolence. So, for example, one of his actions, he talked a lot about civil disobedience and passive resistance, which means if a law is unjust, don't follow it. And again, this doesn't mean stepping back. It doesn't mean sort of giving up and saying, okay, well, forget that law. It means actively not doing something. So one of the best examples is his Salt March, which is when the British told the Indians that there's going to be a salt tax, and which salt is, and he said that's wrong. Salt is a necessity of life. You can't tax something. It's like making water a commodity. It was seen as an act of violence. You can't make something that is absolutely necessary for life a commodity. And so what Gandhi did was he and many people with him went and marched towards the ocean where people were going to make salt. And this was an active breaking of the law. And in Gandhi's view, being being nonviolent took a lot of courage. It took a lot of stamina, and it invoked suffering, and it often meant you took harm. It meant you were the one who received the suffering. And so in the case of the Salt March, when Gandhi and these people walked to the ocean, they bore the brunt of British anger in that case, and they were beat with sticks. I mean, these people were beaten, and there was blood, and there was violence. It was not a pretty scene. But what the question here was who someone is going to suffer. Again, this gets back to this violence is inevitable. Someone is going to suffer in this case, but who is the recipient of that suffering? And so in Gandhi's view, the question is, who is going to receive? Who will be the recipient and take on that suffering? If there is going to be violence, if there is going to be suffering. And so in his view, nonviolence is something that is active, and it's hard. It's not something that's easy. It's actually something that might involve risk to yourself. It might involve your own blood or your own injury, but it's something that it's not sort of it's not the easy way out. It's actually the much stronger thing to do. And he also is able to draw on the metaphor of the warrior. I talked about Arjuna as that warrior. Gandhi was able to draw on the metaphor of the spiritual warrior, the one who has this tough power. The kind of training, for example, that a warrior would to go into war is something that you need to practice nonviolence, like against the British. And so I'm going to pose two sorts of questions here, because I think I've probably talked a lot longer than I actually meant to, which happens frequently. But I'm going to pose two questions here to you and then just sort of open it up. And one is, certainly one of the challenges for Hinduism and things like nonviolence and peace is that it has a history in which people were essentially assigned social roles. And there wasn't a lot of possibility for social mobility for women or people in lower castes. With this Dharma and karma system, it was often very difficult for people to move out of that role. One of the things Gandhi did was really emphasize individual responsibility, and some of his values helped open up the possibility within India that maybe we could renegotiate some of these roles. And there's been a lot of discussion in the last, say 50 to 100 years within India about, how do we balance the importance of tradition with the needs of modernity, with the idea that we want to have a more open society, that people can move around within this. And if we're going to have a peaceful and just society, we're going to have to make it so that people can't be stuck in these roles that maybe their ancestors were. The other question I'll pose is that with the system of Dharma and even karma, one of the major emphases in this system is one of social cohesion. Everything should move smoothly. I was talking about the moral order. If we do everything we're supposed to, then everything will move smoothly. And so the question is, and this is for all traditions, I suppose, is if you emphasize social cohesion, then what gets swept under the rug? Because there's, in a lot of societies, in a lot of cases, there's emphases on resolution, for example. Let's make everything very, peaceful, so to speak. But if that's if that is a primary goal, just resolution, do you sweep things under the rug that maybe need to be out there and discussed? Could injustices be kind of swept under the rug, just so you don't rock the boat, just so things move smoothly and easily? And I think that is a real tension that is not just India, but anywhere. So I'm going to stop there and see what questions you all have. Yes?
You discussed that you've referred to the Lord and referred to the divine a couple of times. And could you discuss that concept in Hinduism?
That's a big question.
Oh, sorry.
But that's okay.
But it may be small. It wasn't clear.
Okay, well, there's sort of two. Hinduism as a whole is considered a polytheistic tradition. And so if a stock answer you'll receive, if someone says how many gods and goddesses are there in India, you'll receive an answer, 330 million. And obviously, no one's gone out and said, okay, there's Shiva, there's Krishna, there's... What in a Hindu world, that means it suggests the sort of the effluence and the overpowering and the fact that divinity's everywhere. It's a way of... And you've got all sorts of levels of divinity. So there's all these different deities. At the same time, there's also an underlying, I would say, monism within the Hindu tradition as well. You've got these two poles. And so in much of Hinduism, you've got this idea that there's a concept of Brahman. And Brahman is an ultimate reality that underlies everything. And all the stuff we see around us, you know, all the multiplicity, it's an expression of Brahman. It's not real in and of itself. And so you've got these two poles that they're not mutually exclusive. And many of the different traditions, so like Krishna, devotees of Krishna, they have their own theologies. Devotees of Shiva, they all have their own theologies. And they're not mutually exclusive. But when I refer to the Lord in this case, I was referring specifically to Krishna because the Bhagavad Gita, it tends to be translated as the Song of the Lord. Oh, well, I guess, and then...
Can you speak, or will you speak to the evolution of ritual over time and its importance to this maintenance of Dharma, this connection to everything from the Vedic tradition up through the temple tradition? Complexity.
In some of the earliest, particularly in the early Vedic tradition, you had, and these are rituals we know about. I mean, and as you would imagine, most of the rituals we know about were rituals performed by the elite, the Brahmins, and by Brahmin males particularly. So at least the earliest rituals we know about tended to be, there's a ritual relationship. And when I talked about Dharma and maintaining the universe and sustaining, there were sets of rituals that Brahmins did. Some of these were really large rituals that could take up to months. Other rituals were smaller householder rituals that people might do every day, for example, in their home. People kept their ritual fires going. But one of the ideas was there was a responsibility. It's almost like a contract. Assuming that if the rituals are done well, then the results are essentially guaranteed. And in the early Vedic tradition, most of the rituals were for results like sons or more cattle or good crops. And so they did. You give the gods what they're due, and then these ritual rewards will essentially be returned to you. Over time, that's some of the pattern of those rituals continued all through. But after the Vedic period, you get a more speculative period in which many of the ritual practices essentially turned inward. You had the kind of external rituals became much more introspective, and that's when, in this period, about say 800 BCE to about 400 BC, which is a much more speculative period, and that's the same time that you start seeing the development of Jain thought and Buddhist thought. With all those traditions, there was a lot more speculation about the nature of the self, the nature of reality, what sort of rituals were there, what kind of ritual practice. And one thing that happened with ritual anyway was that it became internalized, and people were much more focused on trying to gain, I guess, the aesthetic power, you could say, to have a knowledge of the absolute. Once you get to the temple, I'm going to jump ahead a lot, but the temple tradition, starting all through this, there were also worship of various deities, gods and goddesses. Starting any time about the 8th century onward, we start having a lot more records, because you get these records through Sanskrit, you get these records through different texts emerging, different ritual practices. You get a lot more emphasis on theological traditions. Again, these are what the records that we have. And so you have the devotion, the ritual attention to gods like Shiva and Vishnu and Krishna, often which are a very personal, ecstatic kind of relationships. You get this idea of a personal relationship between the devotee and Krishna or Shiva or whoever that is. And you start to see the development of rituals in temples that were patterned on guest host practices. And these guest host rules were laid out pretty elaborately, even back in the Vedas. And this was, if you have a guest, notions of hospitality were really strong in Hinduism. It is, if you have a guest in your house, what do? You feed them, you offer them water, you give them clothes, you do all these things. The same principles would attend to if you invite the deity into your home or into your temple. So the ritual patterns that, if you go to the temple in India today or in the United States, you'll see ritual patterns that are replicating, in a sense, the kind of things that you would do if you invited a guest to your house. So the rituals, the pujas or seva will give, say, if you're in a Krishna temple, you're inviting the presence of Krishna into the temple. You'll give him water, food, all the things you would do to a normal guest. So I don't know if that answered your question or not. Okay, you had a question.
Well, I haven't answered the previous question, or it is simplistic, in English language especially, and the answer is God. G is for giver, which is Brahma. O is for organizer, that's Vishnu, and D for destroyer, which is Shiva. So you have those three forms of God, and when it comes to Krishna and Rama, and they just are incarnation of Vishnu, and they come into. Hindus feel as far as I'm concerned, I'm Hindu, but they're not a very orthodox. But I'd be very comfortable with Jesus Christ and Muhammad, because according to Bhagavad Gita, whenever there is a problem, serious problem on this earth, someone will come and talk to God. And so Rama came, Krishna came, Jesus Christ came. So.
Yeah, no, that's a great restatement, that within, at least within particularly Vaishnava Hinduism, the idea that you've got to preserve God. Whenever there's a problem, there's a crisis, God in some form or another always comes to help people out. And you see that certainly all over Hinduism, particularly in the Vaishnava, which is again Gandhi's tradition, that whenever there's a crisis, one way or the other, God comes in some form or another. So you've got all these different incarnations or descents of God in lots of different forms.
Discussing your second question, there's a sense in the United States what you can say and what you cannot say, which is political correctness. And that political correctness developed with civil rights movements in the 1960s. So before that, people felt very free to express racism, for example. And we had very abusive words towards minorities. People would say public all the time. And people felt very free to be chauvinistic, to consider speak women as being inferior. What we did is we did two things. First of all, is we educated people. That's what part of the civil rights movement did. But the other thing we did is repress all these opinions. They took them out of the public climate and said, okay, we don't want to hear these opinions anymore. And a couple of years ago, I organized an event, and one of the faculty called homosexuality and disease promotion okay, which in fact is something you never hear about, but people think that. And the problem is when we repress what people think, and we say, we can't say it in public anymore, then their anger will come out in other ways. They will find other ways to work. So you have to kind of manage those feelings. They may be negative feelings, but they have to be expressed and how to discuss. And that's exactly what happens. Right? You just take these things and it's simple. It's not society. You can't say that sort of minority group is inferior. You can't say that. Well, people sort of think that, that's going to come up with different ways.
Yeah, well, it's important to have dialogue. Get things out. So. Yeah.
Would you say it's a feminine spirituality in Hindu tradition?
That's a good question. I'm not sure I can say too much about that. I mean, certainly within the Hindu tradition, there's certainly a lot of goddess worship, and that exists. One thing I can say is that there's particularly within the Vaishnava tradition, I can say the place where I've done field work within North India, which is devotees of Krishna. And they have a really powerful form of the feminine in that particular tradition, and that the idea is that Krishna is the only male, and that all beings, or all humans anyway, are feminine in their approach to Krishna. And the model for this is a form of Hinduism and this is prevalent all about India, but I'll give one example. In the 1600s, this form of sort of ecstatic devotion to Krishna emerged. And the pattern for this is that Krishna is this cowherd boy, and he's surrounded by people who love him. So he's surrounded by these cowherd girls who love him, and his parents and all these folks. And for people and this is when people talk about a relationship with God, within Hinduism, you've got this this relationship with God codified, or I guess a pattern, in a sense it's like dramatic relations, so you're taking on a role. And two of the most important roles for relating to Krishna are feminine. And that one is you relate to, you ask how do you relate, what kind of relationship you have with God, you relate to Krishna with the same kind of love and emotions that a parent would have for a child. Or alternatively, the same kind of sort of young romantic love that teenagers have. So the kind of these young cowboy girls who are all absolutely infatuated with Krishna, have this overwhelming love. They're willing to break all kinds of social conventions to have this kind of have love for him. That is a kind of love that is that people cultivate. And so there's poetry, for example, and art that helps put people, just like you're assuming a role. If you're an actor, and so people will talk about assuming roles, or there's a book about being a divine, I forgot the exact title, but some of playing the divine roles, and it's like a theatrical set in a sense that you're taking on the roles and taking on the emotions of these characters towards Krishna. So you're cultivating. So, and that's one example of a kind of female spirituality that is cultivated, and it's by men and women. It's not just women who are doing that. There's a lot more these days in research in India about women and female spirituality in the tradition, probably the last 10 or 15 years. There's a lot more attention to women's rituals, for example, pilgrimages that primarily women do. What the kind of fasting, one aspect of that's very important practice for women within Hinduism is the concept of the fast. And one of the reasons is that women are believed to have what's called Shakti, or power. And then that's the part of feminine nature. Women have this power, and so what's incumbent upon women because that is to protect their families, particularly husbands and sons. So this is, so for example, a widow is a woman who basically abused that power, did not say fulfill it. And so one of the things that a lot of women will do is take on different kinds of behaviors, or fasts particularly, that will help ensure the health of their children and their spouse. And so this can be, these fasts could be something you do once a month. It could be abstaining, say, from eggs on Monday or something like that. But that ability to maintain that power and do something fast is a really important part of Hindu women's practice. Yeah.
You mentioned the tradition of sweeping the floor before you walk, so as not to damage insects or smaller creatures. But what about dietary restrictions within Hinduism, and why does it seem like so many that come here abandon their dietary restrictions so easily?
I don't know if they abandon them when they're here. I think there's just, I think what's going on is that there's so many multiple dietary practices that.
Oh, no, I was just curious.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. Hinduism has a reputation that, or a lot of people think about India that everyone's vegetarian or nobody eats meat, and there's a lot of meat eating in India. There always has. Now, I would say most Hindus will not eat beef, just like most. Well, I don't think any Muslims will eat pork. So sort of pork and beef are pretty much off the table for the most part within India. But those dietary restrictions are, there's certainly been plenty of meat eating within India. Brahmins, particularly in the south, have the most strict dietary restrictions. And I think that certainly people's dietary preferences change when they come here. They broaden up to some degree, or they change. But there's still plenty of different types of eating regimens in India even today. And those can differ by gender, by different caste, maybe stage of life. There's certainly more. There's depending on what you're doing. When I mentioned the dietary restrictions for the Jains and the sweeping, that is one particular religious tradition within India, and the people who do that are basically monks and nuns who are doing it. So that's a really strict kind of eating practice. Most Jains are not going to do that, but I would say most Jains do have fairly strict dietary practices. Certainly no meat, and many of if you go to a restaurant in India, they may have a Jain section, and that will not have things like potatoes. You still get to dig up like any kind of root vegetables, for example. And meat eating is growing in India. I mean, the percentage of people who eat meat is growing really fast, and in fact, factory farming is growing dramatically within India. So I mean, they're dealing with similar agriculture and food issues that we are in the United States. So it's happening in both here and there. But that's a good question. Yeah.
You mentioned how religion is, in India, there's a lot of gods and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So I was just wondering, how come there's not a lot of conflict? Because in political science spectrum, they say that religion is one of the main causes of conflict. Because people want to force what they believe on others. So how come there's not as much conflict as it seems to be?
No, that's a really good question. I mean, obviously there is some conflict in India with religion, but I would say the bulk of it tends to be more on, for example, on resources. And I would say even, that I would want to step back a little bit, and even a lot of the conflict we have over religion in the world today, a lot of it does have base in say, fighting over resources, for example. So a certain amount of conflict in the world that looks like it's ostensibly between religious traditions, often it does have something to do with access to water, for example. Even if you can look at some of the conflict in the Middle East, and a lot of that has to do with access to water, not just, like for example in Israel and Palestine, it has to do who can get rights to the River Jordan, who can meet their material needs. So a certain amount of conflict that we say is religious often has its roots within fights over scarce resources. Because within Hinduism, I would say if anything, yes, there are all sorts of, there's so many different deities. You rarely have fights between groups, like, you don't have like the Shaivites coming and beating up on the Vaishnavas. And I would say if anything, you can look at it in a more familial kind of context. Many of these gods, many people worship multiple gods. It's not just, one fighting the other. And there's also not such an attachment to theology within Hinduism. You don't have such a statement of belief. You have to believe this, or you have to believe that. And there's a lot more continuity among all sorts of Hindus on ideas about Dharma, ideas about ritual practice. There's a lot within, even though there's many different deities, there's a lot of commonalities about basic concepts of karma and Dharma, ideas about how you practice ritual. Even say a follower of say Shiva could walk into a Vaishnava temple and feel very comfortable and know exactly what's going on. I mean, there may be some differences, but they're not going to be uncomfortable, and many Hindus will go to a number of different temples. And so if, even in their hometown, they go to a Shiva temple, a Vishnu temple. So you don't have such divisions. The differences between the different deities within Hinduism are nothing like the differences between, say, like Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. There's a lot of commonality, and there's whatever conflicts there are, they don't tend to be specifically about over the particular deities. If there are conflicts, like say you may have like Hindu-Muslim violence, that's more about, say, resources, for example, who's getting the jobs. And those tend to be social conflicts, many of which were originally, or to some extent, some of those were set up by the British, who were good at dividing populations against each other. They've been very good at that in their history. And a lot of those tensions have remained wherever the British were. If you have a conflict and the British were there, you can see that. So.
My misunderstanding, the concept of the divine in the Hindu tradition, that they think of, there may be pantheistic gods, thousands, but they all represent the same God. So the one might be a follower of Vishnu, or one may be a follower of Shiva. They think of it as the same divine. They're not separating it as, oh, he's a Shiva guy, he's different than me. They're saying, well, he worships that aspect of the divine, whereas I worship this aspect of the divine. And if I need that aspect, I can go to that as well.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And so it's not, you don't have this divisive, oh, you're over there, or number, you're not talking about different things.
Is that correct?
Yeah, no, that's a good way of putting it.
Oh,
That's good. Anything else?